In the candlelight of an Alabama plantation house in 1820, one enslaved man was ordered to serve two women who shared the same face, the same voice, and the same gaze. Even after years beneath the same roof, even after memorizing footsteps and breathing patterns, he could not tell them apart. But what terrified him most was not their identical appearance. It was the way they seemed to know when he failed, and how neither sister ever admitted which one he had served. If you are drawn to the forgotten, the erased, and the stories history tried to bury beneath ledgers and polite language, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the very end, because this story does not reveal itself all at once, and what it leaves behind tends to linger long after the telling is done. The house stood just beyond the slow bend of the Alabama River, built high enough to escape the seasonal floods, and isolated enough that silence could gather without interruption, its white-painted columns already beginning to yellow under the weight of southern heat and time. From a distance it looked orderly, respectable, even serene, the kind of place travelers passed without a second glance. But Elijah felt the wrongness before he ever crossed the threshold. It was not fear exactly, nor dread in the ordinary sense, but a sensation of imbalance, as if the air itself was slightly misaligned, as though every sound arrived a breath too early or too late. He had been brought there in the spring of 1820, sold along with two others whose names he never learned, led up the wide steps and into a front hall that smelled faintly of polish and old fabric and something else he could not place, something like breath held too long. He was told he would serve the mistresses of the house, two women who owned the property jointly, sisters by birth and by will, identical in a way that went far beyond resemblance. Elijah did not understand what that meant until he saw them. They stood at the far end of the hall, dressed in matching dark gowns despite the heat, hands folded in the same precise manner, heads inclined at the same angle as they regarded him, with expressions that were not unkind, but not welcoming either, expressions that seemed practiced, mirrored, deliberate. For a moment, Elijah thought he was seeing double because of exhaustion or nerves, but when one of them spoke and the other smiled at exactly the same instant, he realized the truth was far more unsettling. They were not simply similar, they were the same height, the same narrowness of shoulder, the same pale eyes that reflected the light without warmth, the same faint mark near the left temple that looked like a scar or a birthmark, perfectly replicated. Even their voices, when they spoke, seemed to occupy the same register, neither higher nor lower, neither softer nor sharper, as though sound itself had been copied and placed twice into the room. Elijah lowered his gaze as he had been taught, but even with his eyes downcast, he felt their attention press against him, a doubled weight that made his spine tighten. One of them spoke his assigned name, Elijah, and the other nodded, and for a fleeting second he could not tell which mouth had moved first. From that first moment, a rule was established without ever being spoken. He was expected to know which sister he was serving at any given time, and ignorance would not excuse him. The house, he quickly learned, operated on assumptions rather than explanations. He was shown his duties, his place to sleep, the routes he was expected to take through the corridors, but no one explained the sisters. No one told him how to tell them apart, or if it was even possible. At first, he assumed differences would emerge naturally, as they always did with people, a preference for certain foods, a temper quicker to rise, a laugh more easily drawn, but days passed into weeks, and weeks into months, and no such differences revealed themselves. The sisters dressed alike even when alone. They favored the same meals, drank tea at the same hours, walked the same paths through the house, their footsteps producing the same measured rhythm against the polished floors. Elijah began to pay attention to the smallest details, the way one might inhale before speaking, the way fingers rested against porcelain cups, the way eyes moved when listening. But every observation betrayed him. If he thought he noticed a difference one day, it vanished the next, as if corrected. Worse, the sisters never acknowledged his confusion. They never corrected him when he addressed one incorrectly, never clarified which of them had given an order, never offered the mercy of distinction. Instead, they watched. That watching became the most exhausting part of his service. It followed him from room to room, from task to task, an unblinking awareness that made every decision feel like a test he did not know he was taking. When he brought a letter meant for one sister to the other, silence fell so completely that the house itself seemed to lean closer. The sister receiving the letter accepted it without comment, read it, folded it, and set it aside. Hours later, Elijah was summoned and punished, not violently, not dramatically, but with a precise coldness that communicated something far worse than anger. He was told only that he had failed. Failed whom and how was left unsaid. After that, he began to realize the danger was not in disobedience, but in uncertainty. Certainty was safety. Certainty was impossible. The other enslaved people in the house avoided the sisters whenever they could, and they avoided Elijah most of all. He noticed how conversation stopped when he approached, how eyes slid away, how even those who had lived on the plantation longer than he had never spoke of the women directly. When he asked one older man quietly how he might tell the sisters apart, the man looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear and said only, "You won't," before turning away. At night, lying on his narrow pallet, Elijah listened to the house breathe. That was the only way he could think to describe it. A subtle expansion and contraction, wood settling and unsettling, as if the building were alive in a way he had never encountered before. Sometimes he heard footsteps in the corridor and could not tell if they were approaching or retreating. Sometimes he heard a voice murmur his name, soft and indistinct, and could not be sure whether it came from the left or the right, or from within the walls themselves. He began to dream of mirrors, of standing between two identical reflections that moved when he did not, spoke when he was silent, smiled when he felt nothing at all. Each morning, he woke with the sense that the day ahead would require a choice he was unprepared to make, a distinction he could not see. The sisters never raised their voices, they never argued with one another. Elijah never witnessed them together for long. If he saw one in a room, the other was always elsewhere, as though the house itself ensured their separation. Sliding doors closed just in time, turning hallways into blind corridors. And yet, despite this separation, they seemed to share knowledge instantaneously. An order given by one was already known by the other. A mistake made in one wing of the house was answered for in another. It was as if Elijah were not serving two women, but one will expressed through two bodies, and the impossibility of that thought unsettled him more than anything else. By the end of his first year, Elijah understood that the house of two shadows was not testing his obedience alone. It was testing his sense of reality. It was teaching him slowly and deliberately that truth could be split, that identity could be duplicated, and that punishment could come not from wrongdoing but from not knowing which truth applied. And that lesson, once learned, would be very difficult to unlearn. By the Elijah understood that certainty was the only currency the house accepted. He also understood that certainty was something it would never give him. The rules that governed his days were not written, not announced, not even implied in the ordinary way commands were delivered on plantations. They existed instead as consequences that appeared after the fact, arriving with a precision that suggested careful observation rather than impulsive cruelty. Elijah learned quickly that the sisters did not need to explain themselves. Explanation would have introduced a shared reality, and shared reality was something they did not seem to want. Each morning began with the same quiet tension. He rose before dawn, completed his tasks with the exactness expected of him, and waited for instruction that might come from either sister at any moment, in any room. When one spoke to him, he listened with a focus that bordered on desperation, memorizing not just the words but the cadence, the pause between syllables, the way the voice entered the space. He told himself that if he listened closely enough, if he paid enough attention, some difference would reveal itself. Yet every attempt at distinction failed him. A phrase delivered softly one day was delivered sharply the next, by the other sister, in the same tone he thought he had learned to trust. Even posture betrayed him. One afternoon, he noticed that one sister rested more weight on her left foot while standing near the window. He filed this away as a possible marker, a lifeline. 2 days later, he saw the other sister standing in the same place, resting her weight on the same foot, gazing out at the river with the same distant expression. It was not mimicry, he realized. It was alignment. The sisters did not copy each other. They maintained themselves as a single pattern. The house reinforced this pattern in subtle ways. Furniture was arranged symmetrically, corridors mirrored one another, and even light seemed to fall evenly on both sides of the structure, as though imbalance would offend something unseen. When Elijah made a mistake, it was never addressed directly. No accusation was voiced, no correction offered. Instead, he was summoned hours later, sometimes by the sister he believed he had served correctly, and subjected to punishment that felt less like discipline and more like recalibration. The message was always the same, though never spoken: you failed to know. Once he delivered a tray of food to the sitting room where one sister waited. He was certain of it this time. The room, the hour, the request, all aligned with his memory. She accepted the tray without comment, thanked him in a neutral tone, and dismissed him. Later that evening he was called into the hallway outside the study and made to stand there in silence for what felt like an eternity, while one sister paced slowly behind him. She did not touch him. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, "You brought what was not asked for." Elijah wanted to ask which one of them had asked, wanted to plead that he had done exactly as instructed, but he knew better. Questions only deepened the failure. The other enslaved people sensed the tension that clung to him like smoke. They watched him with a mixture of sympathy and relief, grateful that whatever strange scrutiny governed the sisters' attention had settled on him rather than themselves. Elijah noticed how they avoided being alone with the mistresses, how they deferred tasks that might require personal interaction. When they spoke of the sisters at all, it was in vague terms, using they instead of names, as though singular reference itself were dangerous. One woman, who had served in the house years before Elijah arrived, pulled him aside one evening and whispered, "Don't try to separate them." When he asked what she meant, she shook her head, eyes darting toward the main house. "The house doesn't like that," she said, and refused to say more. Over time, Elijah began to sense that the rules extended beyond behavior into thought. On days when he felt confident, when he believed he had finally discerned a difference, however slight, punishment followed swiftly, almost as if his confidence itself had triggered it. On days when he surrendered to uncertainty, when he moved carefully and without assumption, the house seemed calmer, the sisters less attentive. It was then that he realized something deeply unsettling. The sisters were not testing his accuracy, they were testing his doubt. They wanted him unsure. They wanted him to move through the house without ever trusting his own perception, without ever standing firmly in a single interpretation of events. Certainty threatened the system they had created. Doubt sustained it. This understanding did not make his days easier. If anything, it made them more exhausting. Every interaction required calculation. Every task carried the risk of unseen error. He stopped using names altogether, addressing the sisters only when spoken to, answering questions with minimal words, deferring decisions whenever possible. Even so, mistakes continued to occur, or perhaps were created where none existed. The sisters' knowledge of his actions seemed instantaneous. An order given in the morning was referenced in the afternoon by the other sister as though she had been present. A comment made in passing was repeated later, altered just enough to make him question his memory. Elijah began to doubt not only which sister he served, but whether his memories of conversations were reliable at all. At night, lying awake, he replayed the day's events again and again, searching for the moment where he might have gone wrong. The house offered no answers. It only creaked softly, settling into itself, as though absorbing his confusion and storing it away. He noticed that the sisters' rooms were never entered by anyone but him. Doors were closed gently but firmly, and he was never permitted to linger inside. Yet even within those rooms, the symmetry persisted. Identical furniture, identical arrangements, identical personal items, two lives arranged as one doubled space. The effect was disorienting, like stepping into a reflection that did not quite behave as expected. One evening, as he was leaving one of the rooms, he caught sight of himself in a mirror positioned at the end of the hall. For a moment, the reflection seemed delayed. His movements echoed a fraction too late. He stopped, heart pounding, and the reflection stopped with him. He told himself it was exhaustion, that the strain of constant vigilance was playing tricks on his eyes. Still, the feeling lingered. Elijah began to understand that the unspoken rules were not designed to be learned and mastered. They were designed to be lived within indefinitely. The sisters did not want obedience that ended in competence. They wanted obedience that never stabilized, that kept the servant perpetually off balance. In that imbalance lay control far more complete than any whip could achieve. By the end of his second year in the house, Elijah no longer trusted the idea that truth was singular. He moved through his days as though reality itself was split, as though every action existed in two versions simultaneously, one correct, one punishable, and he would only learn which was which after the fact. The rules that were never spoken had done their work. They had not taught him how to serve better. They had taught him how to doubt himself. And in that doubt the sisters' power over him deepened, silent and absolute, like the house that held them all within its carefully mirrored walls. By the third year of Elijah's service in the house, the tests no longer arrived as isolated incidents. They became a rhythm woven so tightly into the structure of his days that he could not remember what it felt like to exist without them. They were no longer reactions to mistakes, but provocations, deliberate situations engineered to expose uncertainty, to draw it out into the open where it could be observed and corrected through quiet punishment. The sisters refined their methods with patience. One morning, Elijah would be instructed to prepare the study for a guest who never arrived. The sister who gave the order would later deny having done so, her expression calm, her eyes steady, as if she were describing an entirely different day. In the afternoon, the other sister would mention the guest in passing, asking why the room had been prepared so early, her tone suggesting mild disappointment rather than accusation. Elijah would stand there, caught between two versions of the same instruction, aware that choosing either explanation would lead him further into error. Silence became his only defense, but silence, too, was sometimes interpreted as failure. The sisters learned quickly which forms of restraint unsettled him most. They asked questions that required memory rather than action. Which room did I ask you to clean yesterday? Who told you to bring the ledger upstairs? When did I say the silver should be polished? These were not questions meant to be answered. They were traps designed to force him to commit to a version of events that could be overturned at any moment. If he answered confidently, punishment followed. If he hesitated, punishment followed. If he admitted uncertainty, punishment followed, delivered with the same quiet efficiency, as though the method mattered less than the outcome, reminding him that his perception was not trusted and therefore should not be trusted by himself. Over time, Elijah began to notice patterns that disturbed him more deeply than the tests themselves. The sisters never contradicted each other directly. They never argued. Instead, one would simply replace the other's version of reality with a slightly altered one, close enough to cause confusion but distant enough to invalidate certainty. It was as if they were editing the world in real time, rewriting moments just enough to keep him disoriented. Once, after being punished for delivering a message incorrectly, Elijah dared to replay the moment in his mind with painstaking detail. He remembered the room, the angle of the light, the exact phrasing of the request. He remembered thinking, with a rare flicker of confidence, that he had finally recognized which sister stood before him. The memory felt solid. Yet when the punishment came, delivered by the same sister he believed he had served correctly, the solidity of that memory cracked. Doubt seeped in, corrosive and immediate. If she denied the interaction, then perhaps it had never happened as he remembered. Perhaps the certainty itself had been the mistake. The tests extended beyond the sister's words into the physical space of the house. Objects were moved subtly, almost imperceptibly. A book he had placed on a table would appear later on a shelf in another room. A vase he had dusted carefully would be found smudged again, as though touched by unseen hands. At first, Elijah suspected other servants, but the pattern did not fit. The changes occurred too precisely, too selectively, always connected to moments when he felt most sure of himself. Once, he was instructed to retrieve a shawl from a specific chest in one sister's room. He opened the chest and found it empty. Certain he must have misunderstood, he checked again later, only to find the shawl folded neatly inside, exactly where it should have been. When he presented it, the sister receiving it looked at him with mild surprise and said, "You found it so quickly," as though testing whether he would acknowledge the impossibility of that statement. He did not. He learned not to. The sister's expressions during these tests fascinated and terrified him in equal measure. They did not display satisfaction or cruelty in the usual sense. Their faces remained composed, almost curious, as if they were observing an experiment rather than a person. Elijah began to understand Tha. He was not being punished for moral failings or even for disobedience. He was being measured. His reactions, his hesitation, his attempts to reconcile conflicting information, all of it was data, collected and refined. This realization deepened his sense of unreality. If he was an object of study, then the rules governing his suffering were not personal, they were procedural. That knowledge stripped the experience of even the small comfort of being targeted for something he had done. At night, the tests followed him into sleep. His dreams became labyrinths of repetition and reversal. He dreamed of corridors that looped back into themselves, of doors that opened onto identical rooms, of voices calling his name from behind him while he stood frozen, unable to turn without choosing the wrong direction. In these dreams, the sisters sometimes appeared as separate figures, sometimes as a single shape that split and recombined as he watched. He woke each morning with his jaw clenched, his body already braced for the day's evaluations. The other enslaved people noticed the change in him. His movements grew cautious, his speech sparse. He avoided eye contact not only with the sisters, but with everyone. When spoken to, he paused before answering, weighing the risk of each word. Some mistook this for arrogance or slowness. Others recognized it for what it was, a survival strategy. One evening, an older woman who worked in the laundry caught him staring at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. She asked quietly if he was unwell. He considered telling her the truth, that he no longer trusted his own senses, that the world felt divided into overlapping versions he could not reconcile. But he knew such honesty would not help him. Instead, he said he was tired. She nodded, understanding more than he had said. The tests grew more intricate as time passed. The sisters began involving other people indirectly, issuing instructions through intermediaries, then denying them later. Elijah learned that even second-hand orders could be weaponized. If he acted on them, he risked punishment for following instructions that were later disavowed. If he ignored them, he risked punishment for negligence. There was no correct response, only varying degrees of error. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elijah's sense of self began to erode. He no longer thought of himself as someone who acted. He thought of himself as someone who reacted, constantly adjusting to forces he could not predict or control. His memories lost their sharpness. He began to question events even as they occurred, wondering whether the version he was experiencing would later be denied. This constant self-surveillance exhausted him more than physical labor ever had. One afternoon, after a particularly subtle test involving a misplaced key and a denied conversation, Elijah found himself standing alone in the hallway, heart racing, unsure how long he had been there. The house was quiet, unnaturally so. He became aware of his own breathing, loud in the silence. For a brief, terrifying moment, he could not remember what task he had been performing or which sister had last spoken to him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The tests were no longer external challenges to be endured. They had become internalized. The sisters no longer needed to actively confuse him. His mind was doing the work for them, questioning, revising, undermining itself at every turn. That night, as he lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, Elijah understood that the tests had succeeded in their deepest aim. They had not merely taught him that he could not tell the sisters apart. They had taught him that he could not rely on his own experience as evidence of truth. And once that lesson was learned, once doubt had taken root so thoroughly, the sisters' control no longer depended on constant oversight. The uncertainty lived inside him now, replicating itself endless, a quiet echo of the doubled world he was forced to inhabit. By the time Elijah understood that the tests no longer needed to be announced, he also understood that the house itself had begun to participate, as though the walls and corridors had absorbed the sisters' intentions and learned how to carry them forward without instruction. The building no longer felt like a neutral container for events. It felt responsive, alert, subtly adjusting itself around his movements. Floorboards creaked only when he hesitated, not when he walked with purpose. Doors that were usually stiff opened silently when he approached uncertainly, as if inviting him into error, while those he reached for with confidence resisted him. catching on their frames just long enough to make him doubt whether he had remembered correctly. Light behaved strangely in certain rooms, shifting with the time of day in ways that made spaces appear identical even when they were not, flattening distinction until hallways mirrored one another so precisely that Elijah sometimes found himself pausing mid-step, unsure which direction he had come from. He began to sense that the house was watching him in the same way the sisters did, not with eyes, but with attention. The sensation was difficult to describe, but unmistakable, a pressure in the air, a subtle tightening that occurred whenever he entertained the thought that he understood what was happening. On those days, the house seemed to respond by rearranging itself just enough to contradict him. Objects moved without explanation. A chair he had left pulled back from the table would be tucked neatly beneath it when he returned, or pushed out farther than before, as though someone had sat there briefly and then vanished. Once, he set down a tray in the west parlor and left the room for no more than a minute, only to return and find it gone. He searched quietly, heart pounding, retracing his steps, until he found the tray placed carefully on a sideboard in the east parlor, arranged exactly as he had left it. No one admitted to moving it. No one needed to. The message was clear. The house was capable of correcting him on its own. Mirrors became another source of unease. Elijah had never paid them much attention before, but now he could not avoid noticing how often his reflection seemed slightly out of sync, as though the glass required a moment to decide which version of him to display. Sometimes, for the briefest instant, he thought he saw another figure standing just behind his reflected shoulder, identical in posture, gone the moment he turned. He told himself it was fatigue, the inevitable result of constant vigilance, but the repetition wore down his resistance. Even the sounds of the house shifted. At night, when he lay awake listening, the usual settling noises took on a deliberate rhythm. Creaks echoed where footsteps should have been. Soft thuds sounded like doors closing far away, though no one was moving. Occasionally he heard voices murmuring indistinctly, not loud enough to form words, but carrying the cadence of conversation. When he strained to listen, the sounds stopped. When he tried to ignore them, they resumed, persistent, patient. The sisters' presence within this changing environment felt both distant and absolute. They appeared less frequently in his direct line of sight, as though the house had taken over much of the work that once required their intervention. When they did appear, it was often in spaces that forced Elijah into a choice. 2 identical corridors, 2 similar rooms, 2 moments in time that blurred together. Once he was summoned to bring documents upstairs. He followed the familiar route, only to find himself at the top of the stairs facing 2 doors that appeared equally worn, equally lit, equally familiar. He could not remember which one belonged to which sister. His pulse hammered in his ears as he stood there, documents clutched in his hands, aware that the delay itself might be naught. Ned. When he finally chose a door and knocked, the sister inside accepted the papers without comment. Hours later, the other sister asked why the documents had been delivered late. Elijah felt something inside him fracture quietly. He realized then that the house had begun to anticipate his movements, arranging moments like this with cruel efficiency. It did not need to punish him directly. It only needed to create conditions where punishment became inevitable. The other enslaved people sensed the change as well, though none of them spoke of it openly. They avoided certain areas of the house without knowing why, choosing longer routes rather than pass through hallways that felt too symmetrical, too quiet. Some refused to enter rooms alone, claiming headaches or dizziness. A few spoke in hushed tones of the house being awake, though they could not explain what that meant. Elijah listened to these fragments with a detached familiarity. What unsettled him most was not that the house felt alive, but that it felt aligned with the sisters, with their need for control, with their insistence on a reality that could not be pinned down. The building had become an extension of their will, or perhaps it always had been, waiting only for someone like Elijah to notice. His dreams grew more vivid, more invasive. He dreamed of walking through the house endlessly, each room opening into another identical space, each decision leading him deeper rather than closer to escape. In some dreams, the sisters stood at opposite ends of a long hallway, facing each other, and as he walked toward one, the other began to move as well, matching his pace, ensuring he could never reach either. In others, The house itself shifted around him, walls sliding silently, rearranging passages until he stood in the center, disoriented and alone. He woke from these dreams with the sensation that he had not fully returned, that some part of him remained wandering those mirrored corridors. During the day, he caught himself hesitating over the simplest actions. He double-checked tasks he had already completed. He replayed conversations immediately after they occurred, questioning their content, even as the words still echoed in his ears. The house rewarded this hesitation by tightening its grip, offering fewer moments of clarity, fewer spaces where he could orient himself. He realized with a slow, sinking dread that the house was learning him as much as he was trying to learn it. It knew his patterns now, his pauses, his habits, his attempts at caution, and it used that knowledge to refine its disruptions. Where once he had been tested overtly, now he was nudged subtly, guided into uncertainty with almost gentle persistence. The sisters, when they did intervene, seemed pleased not with his mistakes, but with the depth of his confusion. Their gazes lingered longer, their questions became more abstract, less tied to specific tasks and more to his perception of events. "Did you feel the house change today?" one asked him once, her tone casual, almost conversational. Elijah did not answer. He could not tell whether the question itself was another test. The house seemed to respond to his silence with a soft creak somewhere above them, as though amused. It was then that Elijah understood the full scope of what was happening. The sisters had not merely trained him to doubt his senses, they had allowed the environment itself to become an instrument of that doubt. The house no longer needed constant supervision. It had learned the rules that were never spoken and enforced them with quiet consistency. Elijah moved through it now like a guest in his own fear, careful, uncertain, aware that every step might be observed not just by human eyes, but by the structure that enclosed him. The realization did not bring panic. It brought something worse: resignation. He understood that the house was no longer something he could navigate. It was something he inhabited, something that shaped him surely as walls shape a room. And as that understanding settled in, heavy and inescapable, Elijah felt the boundaries of his own mind grow less distinct, as though he too were becoming part of the house's mirrored design, another surface reflecting doubt back upon itself endlessly. By the time Elijah realized the house no longer required instruction to unsettle him, he also realized that the sisters had begun to withdraw in a way that felt intentional, as though their presence was no longer necessary to maintain the state they had created. They appeared less frequently, but when they did, their words carried a new quality, less concerned with tasks and more with perception, less focused on what he did and more on what he believed he understood. It was during this phase that the confession took shape, not as a single moment of revelation, but as a slow tightening of expectation around him, a sense that he was being prepared for something he would never be allowed to say aloud. The sisters began asking questions that had no practical purpose. They asked him how the house felt at different hours of the day. They asked whether certain rooms seemed larger or smaller than he remembered. They asked whether he believed two people could share a single thought without speaking. Each question was delivered calmly, almost gently, but Elijah sensed the weight behind them. These were not inquiries meant to be answered honestly. They were invitations to step into a particular understanding of reality, one that required his consent to complete itself. He learned to respond with neutrality, offering answers that revealed nothing, but even this restraint felt inadequate. The house itself reacted to these exchanges, the air growing dense, the sounds receding as though the building were listening more closely than before. One evening, after a long day of subtle tests and unspoken evaluations, Elijah was summoned to the smaller parlor, a room rarely used and positioned in such a way that it mirrored another room on the opposite side of the house almost exactly. One sister waited for him there, seated near the window, her face half lit by the fading light. She did not look at him immediately. Instead, she watched the shadows lengthen across the floor as though measuring time by their movement. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual, stripped of its usual neutrality. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "whether the difficulty lies in us or in you?" The question settled heavily in the room. Elijah felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the reflexive urge to search for the correct answer, the one that would minimize harm. But there was no correct answer here, only implications. To say the difficulty lay with him would confirm his inadequacy, his failure to perceive properly. To say it lay with them would challenge the entire structure of power that governed his existence. He said nothing. Silence had become his safest language, but this time it felt like refusal rather than caution. The sister turned her gaze toward him then, and for the first time in years, Elijah thought he saw something like uncertainty flicker across her face. It vanished almost immediately, replaced by that familiar composure, but the moment lingered in his mind. She asked him another question, one that struck closer to the core of his fear. "If I were not who you think I am," she said, "would you know?" Elijah's pulse quickened. He realized with sudden clarity that this was the confession being demanded of him, not a statement of guilt or wrongdoing, but an admission of epistemic failure, a declaration that he could not distinguish, could not know, could not trust his own experience. To confess that would be to surrender the last fragile boundary of his selfhood. He remained silent. The sister watched him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though confirming a hypothesis. She dismissed him without further comment. That night, the house was restless. Usual creaks and murmurs intensified, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to identify their source. Elijah lay awake, staring into the darkness, replaying the conversation again and again. He wondered whether his silence had been a mistake, whether he had failed another unspoken test. Yet beneath the anxiety, another feeling stirred, something like resolve. For the first time, he sensed that whatever the sisters wanted from him, it was not obedience in the conventional sense. They wanted validation. They wanted him to articulate the reality they had constructed, to give it voice and thereby make it complete. The confession they sought was not about his inability to tell them apart. It was about accepting that distinction itself was meaningless within their domain. Over the following days, the pressure increased. The sisters' questions grew more direct, though still framed as casual conversation. One asked whether he believed identity was fixed or fluid. Another asked whether two people could truly be separate if they shared the same history, the same desires, the same will. Elijah recognized these inquiries for what they were, attempts to guide him toward a particular conclusion, one that would dissolve the need for distinction entirely. If he accepted that, then his confusion would no longer be a problem. It would be the correct response. The house echoed this shift. Spaces that had once felt merely symmetrical now felt fused, as though boundaries between rooms were thinning. Elijah sometimes found himself standing in a doorway, uncertain whether he had entered or exited a space. Time itself seemed to blur. He struggled to remember whether certain conversations had occurred in the morning or the evening, whether tasks had been completed hours ago or days earlier. The environment no longer contradicted him sharply, it enveloped him, smoothing over inconsistencies until everything felt equally uncertain. One afternoon he encountered both sisters in the same room for the first time in what felt like years. They stood facing each other, identical silhouettes framed by the light from opposite windows. The sight sent a jolt through him, a visceral reminder of the impossibility that had defined his existence. They turned toward him simultaneously. One spoke, then the other continued the sentence without pause, their voices blending so seamlessly that Elijah could not tell where one ended and the other began. "You have been very careful," they said together, "but care is not the same as understanding." Elijah felt the urge to speak rise within him, to finally articulate the truth he had been circling for so long, that he could not tell them apart, that he no longer believed there was a meaningful difference to be found, that the effort itself had hollowed him out. The words pressed against his throat, heavy and insistent. He sensed that if he spoke them, something would change irrevocably. The house seemed to hold its breath, the air growing still, expectant, and in that moment, Elijah made a choice that surprised even him. He lowered his gaze and said nothing, the silence stretched, taut and resonant. The sisters exchanged a look, if it was an exchange at all, and then, without another word, one of them turned and left the room. The other followed a moment later. Elijah was left alone, his heart pounding, the unspoken confession hanging in the air like a presence of its own. In the days that followed, the sisters did not revisit the moment. They did not punish him. They did not reward him. Instead, something shifted subtly in their behavior. The tests became less frequent, but more ambiguous. The house remained attentive, but its disruptions felt less corrective and more observational. Elijah sensed that his refusal to confess had altered the dynamic, introducing an element of uncertainty on their side as well. He had not reclaimed control, such a thing was impossible, but he had withheld something they wanted. That withholding. G became his quiet resistance. He continued to serve, to move through the mirrored spaces, to endure the ongoing erosion of certainty. But within him, a boundary remained intact, however fragile. He would not articulate the reality they sought to impose. He would not complete the circuit of their design by naming it aloud. The confession that was never given took on a strange power in its absence. It existed as a gap, a silence that the house could not quite fill, no matter how attentively it listened. And in that gap, Elijah found the smallest measure of agency he had known since arriving. A refusal that did not free him, but prevented his complete dissolution into the doubled world the sisters had built around him. The change did not announce itself. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic rupture to mark the moment when the balance shifted. Instead, the vanishing arrived the way everything else in the house did, quietly, almost politely, as though it had always been part of the plan. Elijah noticed it first in the smallest ways. One morning, he was summoned by a bell that rang from the east wing, a sound he had learned to associate with a particular set of tasks, a particular rhythm of expectation. He went at once, heart already tightening with the familiar anticipation of evaluation, only to find the room empty. The chair near the window sat undisturbed. The teacup on the table was cold. No sister stood waiting. He lingered longer than he should have, listening, uncertain whether this was another test or an error of his own perception. When no reprimand followed, he retreated cautiously, unsettled by the absence more than he would have been by punishment. As the days passed, similar moments accumulated. Requests that once came regularly from one side of the house no longer arrived. Doors that had opened often now remained closed. Elijah began to realize, with a creeping sense of unreality, that one sister had simply ceased to appear. There was no announcement of illness, no mourning ritual, no alteration in routine to acknowledge a loss. The other sister continued exactly as before, moving through the house with the same measured grace, issuing orders in the same calm tone, watching Elijah with the same unblinking attention. And yet, despite the apparent singularity of her presence, nothing felt simpler. If anything, the confusion deepened. Elijah found himself still hesitating, still weighing every decision as though two judgments hovered over him instead of one. The tests did not stop. They changed form. The remaining sister began referring to herself in the plural without emphasis, slipping "we" into sentences where "I" would have sufficed. "We prefer the windows open in the evening," she said once, though no one else was present. When Elijah completed a task, she would sometimes nod and say, "That will do for now," as though someone else had been part of the evaluation. At first, Elijah wondered whether this was grief expressed through habit, a refusal to acknowledge solitude. But the house did not feel like a place in mourning. It felt like a place that had absorbed the loss and adjusted seamlessly, as though one presence had been folded into the other rather than removed. The environment responded accordingly. Spaces that had once felt paired now felt compressed, as if two rooms were trying to occupy the same footprint. Elijah sometimes entered a familiar corridor only to find it shorter than he remembered, its end arriving too quickly, its proportions subtly wrong. He began to lose track of which wing he was in, not because the house had changed drastically, but because it had refined itself into something more unified, less overtly doubled, but no less disorienting. The remaining sister's gaze lingered on him longer now, not with suspicion but with something like appraisal. It was as if she were assessing whether he noticed the change, whether he would comment on it, whether he would finally give voice to the sea. Confession he had withheld. He did not. Silence had become not just a defense, but a discipline. He responded only to what was directly asked, and even then, minimally. He avoided drawing attention to the absence, though it pressed on him constantly, a question that had no safe articulation. The other enslaved people noticed the shift as well, though they spoke of it only obliquely. Some remarked that the house felt quieter, others said it felt heavier. A few claimed they still heard two sets of footsteps at night, pacing in different parts of the structure, sometimes converging, sometimes retreating from one another. Elijah listened to these accounts with a strange detachment. He no longer trusted testimony, not even his own. What troubled him most was the persistence of the tests. Despite the apparent reduction in human actors, the system of evaluation remained intact. Objects continued to move. Instructions were still contradicted after the fact. The house still seemed to anticipate his hesitation. It became increasingly clear that the sister who had vanished had not taken her influence with her. Whatever had governed the house, whatever logic had sustained the doubled reality, continued uninterrupted. One evening, Elijah was asked to bring a candle to the upper landing. When he arrived, the sister stood waiting, her face illuminated from below, casting shadows that made her features appear sharper, almost unfamiliar. She took the candle from him and said, "You are adjusting well." The statement unsettled him more than any accusation. Adjusting implied a process, an adaptation to new conditions. It suggested that the change had been anticipated, planned for. He wondered, briefly, whether the vanishing had been contingent on his refusal to confess, whether his silence had forced a consolidation rather than a confrontation. The thought frightened him, not because it granted him power, but because it implicated him in the outcome. That night the house was eerily still, no murmurs, no creaks. The silence pressed in on him, thick and absolute. He lay awake, acutely aware of his own breathing, his own heartbeat, the only evidence of movement in a structure that felt poised, attentive. In that silence, he became aware of something else, a sense of being addressed without words, not commanded, not tested, but acknowledged. It was as if the house, or whatever consciousness animated it, recognized his presence as a constant now, a fixed element rather than a variable to be corrected. The realization brought no comfort. It brought a deeper unease. In the days that followed, the remaining sister's behavior grew more abstract. She spoke less of tasks and more of conditions. "This house prefers order," she said once, gesturing vaguely at the space around them. "Disorder invites confusion." Elijah nearly laughed at the irony, but he caught himself. Laughter would have been dangerous. Instead, he listened, understanding that the words were not meant to inform him, but to frame the reality she inhabited, a reality in which the house's demands were natural, reasonable, even benevolent. The vanishing of the second sister was never explained, and over time, it became clear that it never would be. It existed as a fact without context, an absence that functioned like a presence. Elijah found that he could no longer remember the sisters separately. When he tried to recall moments from earlier years, the images overlapped, faces merging, voices blending until there was no clear distinction to be made. The effort exhausted him, and he eventually stopped trying. Memory itself had become unreliable terrain. One afternoon, as he stood alone in the main hall, Elijah realized with a dull shock that he could no longer say with certainty whether he had ever truly seen two sisters at all. The possibility that there had always been one, performing multiplicity, settled over him like a fog. He did not know whether this thought represented insight or capitulation. He only knew that it felt plausible, and that plausibility was itself a threat. The vanishing had not simplified his world. It had destabilized it further, collapsing distinctions rather than clarifying them. The house continued to function, the routines continued, and Elijah continued to serve. But something essential had shifted. The doubled reality had not resolved into singularity. It had condensed, intensified, becoming harder to perceive and therefore harder to resist. Elijah sensed that whatever came next would not involve disappearance, but permanence. The system no longer needed two figures to sustain itself. It had learned to operate with one, or perhaps with none at all, relying instead on the internalized uncertainty it had cultivated so carefully within him. And as that understanding settled in, heavy and inescapable, Elijah felt the world narrow around him, the mirrored corridors of his mind aligning ever more closely with the quiet, watchful architecture of the house that refused to let him know where it truly ended. By the time the decision was made to sell Elijah, the house did not react in any way he could recognize as resistance or release. It simply adjusted, the way it always had, as though people were variables that could be removed without altering the equation. He learned of the sale the same way he learned of everything else there, indirectly, without explanation, through a shift in routine that only later revealed its meaning. Tasks he had performed for years were reassigned. Keys he had carried were taken without comment. Rooms that had once required his constant attention no longer summoned him. The remaining sister spoke to him less frequently, and when she did, her words carried no hint of farewell or transition, only the same neutral tone that suggested continuity rather than ending. Elijah understood then that his departure was not being marked because it did not register as a loss within the system of the house. He was not leaving a place. He was being removed from a pattern that would continue without him. On the morning he was led away, the house felt neither lighter nor heavier. It felt complete. As he walked down the familiar steps for the last time, he tried to fix details in his mind. The angle of the columns, the way the light fell across the hall, the precise rhythm of the floorboards. But even as he did, the images began to blur, overlapping with one another until he could not be sure whether he was remembering or inventing them. The road away from the plantation stretched long and exposed, and for the first time in years there were no mirrored corridors, no doors that might open onto identical spaces. The openness should have brought relief. Instead, it terrified him. Without the structure that had governed his every movement, Elijah felt unmoored, as though the ground beneath him were too wide, too undefined. He realized, with a quiet horror, that the house had not merely constrained him, it had provided a framework for his perception. Without it, he struggled to orient himself. The new plantation was different in every observable way, different landscape, different people, different routines, but Elijah found himself responding to it as though the old rules still applied. He hesitated before answering simple questions. He double-checked instructions that required no interpretation. He waited for contradictions that did not come. When orders were given clearly and followed by predictable outcomes, he felt a strange unease, as though something essential were missing. The certainty of cause and effect unsettled him more than ambiguity ever had. His new owner noticed his caution and mistook it for slowness or stubbornness. Elijah was reprimanded for asking unnecessary clarifications, for pausing too long before acting. He tried to explain himself once, fumbling for words, but stopped when he realized he could not articulate the problem without sounding irrational. How could he explain that he no longer trusted singular instructions, that he expected reality to revise itself after the fact? How could he convey that his mind had been trained to anticipate denial, that every memory felt provisional, subject to correction by an authority he could not see? So he fell silent again, returning to the discipline that had kept him alive before. But the silence no longer served him in the same way. Without the mirrored house to contain it, his doubt turned inward, collapsing his sense of time and sequence. Days blurred together. He struggled to recall the order in which events occurred, often mixing memories from the old plantation with his present circumstances. Sometimes, when asked about his past, he described things that could not have happened in the place he now lived, only realizing his mistake when puzzled looks met his words. At night, he dreamed of the house constantly. In some dreams, it appeared exactly as it had been, intact and symmetrical, the remaining sister standing at its center. In others, the house was empty, yet still watchful, its corridors extending endlessly, folding back on themselves. He woke from these dreams disoriented, unsure which life felt more real, the one he had left or the one he now inhabited. Over time, Elijah noticed a troubling change in his memory itself. It no longer functioned as a record of events, but as a field of possibilities. When he tried to recall a conversation, multiple versions presented themselves simultaneously, none of them clearly dominant. He would remember giving an order and receiving one, speaking and remaining silent, being correct and being punished, all layered together. The effort to choose one version over another exhausted him, and eventually he stopped trying. He learned to live with contradiction, to accept that his recollections might never settle into a single, stable form. This adaptation allowed him to function, but at a cost. He began to feel detached from his own experiences, as though they belonged to someone else. The new plantation's routines did not imprint on him the way they did on others. Days passed without leaving a clear trace. When asked how long he had been there, he guessed, often incorrectly, Time, like identity, had lost its edges. Occasionally, other enslaved people asked him about his previous service. Word had spread that he had worked in an unusual house, under unusual mistresses. They were curious, expecting stories of cruelty or excess. Elijah struggled to answer. He could describe events but not their significance. He could say that the mistresses were identical, but the words felt inadequate, failing to convey the depth of the confusion that sameness had produced. When asked directly how many women he had served, he hesitated, the question striking at the core of his fractured memory. 2 seemed correct, 1 also seemed correct. Sometimes neither answer felt true. His hesitation was interpreted as evasiveness, and the conversation usually ended there. As years passed, the intensity of the house's presence in his dreams faded slightly, replaced by a dull, persistent uncertainty that colored everything else. Elijah became known as a man who kept to himself, who followed orders carefully but without initiative, who seemed older than his years. Those who worked alongside him noticed that he rarely spoke of the future, rarely planned beyond the immediate task at hand. It was as though the habit of living in a constantly revised reality had robbed him of the ability to project himself forward with confidence. The most profound damage, however, lay in his sense of self. Elijah no longer felt anchored to a single identity. He responded to his name, but it did not feel like it belonged to him in the way it once might have. He felt interchangeable, replaceable, as though he could be swapped out without consequence, just as the house had swapped presences without explanation. This sense of disposability weighed on him, eroding any lingering belief in his own distinctness. Yet, in rare moments of clarity, he recognized something else within himself, a resistance that had survived despite everything. He had not given the confession the sisters wanted. He had not articulated the reality they sought to impose. That refusal, though it had not freed him, had preserved a fragment of autonomy that no one else could see. It existed now only as a quiet absence, a space where certainty had been denied entry. As Elijah aged, his memories of the house grew less precise, but their emotional residue remained potent. He no longer remembered exact conversations or sequences of events, but he remembered the feeling of being watched, of being evaluated by a reality that shifted to undermine him. That feeling accompanied him everywhere, shaping his interactions, limiting his trust. When asked late in life whether he had ever known kindness, he paused for a long time before answering. Kindness, he realized, required stability, the assurance that an action would be received as intended, that a gesture would not be reinterpreted into harm. In the world he had been trained to inhabit, such assurance did not exist. And so, what servitude had done to his memory was not simply to erase or distort it, but to hollow it out, leaving behind a structure that could hold experience without ever fully claiming it. Elijah carried that structure with him long after he left the House of Two Shadows, a silent architecture built from doubt and restraint, one that shaped his perception of every place thereafter. Even in freedom of distance, he remained bound by the habits of uncertainty, living proof that some forms of control do not end when the chains are removed, but persist in the mind, replicating themselves endlessly, long after the original source has faded from view. In the final years of Elijah's life, when his body had grown thin and his movements careful, the past no longer arrived as images but as sensations, pressure behind the eyes, a tightening in the chest, a reflexive pause before answering even the most harmless question. He lived then on a small plot attached to the quarters of a man who no longer worked the fields, performing light tasks in exchange for food and shelter, his value measured now not in strength but in endurance. People assumed his silence came from age. They were wrong. It came from practice. He had learned, long ago, that words could be turned against the speaker, that clarity invited contradiction, that certainty was a luxury reserved for those whose reality would not be revised without warning. In those last years he spoke only when necessary, and even then, carefully, as though someone unseen might be listening for an error. Occasionally visitors arrived, men who collected stories, preachers who asked questions meant to prepare a soul, younger people curious about the world before them. They asked Elijah about his life, about where he had been, about what he had seen. He answered in fragments, offering details without narrative, facts without interpretation. When pressed to explain, he demurred. There was no language, he knew, that could fully convey what it meant to live inside a system designed to unmake coherence itself. One visitor, persistent and earnest, once asked him whether the story of the identical mistresses was true. Elijah considered the question for a long time. He thought of the house, of the vanishing, of the way memory had folded in on itself until he could no longer say with confidence what had been singular and what had been doubled. Finally, he said, "It was true enough to shape me." The visitor wrote that down, puzzled, and moved on. Elijah watched him go, aware that the words would likely be dismissed as evasive, poetic, or confused. He did not mind. He had long since accepted that his experience would not survive translation. As the seasons passed, Elijah noticed that his dreams had changed. The house no longer appeared whole. Instead, it came in pieces, a stair that led nowhere, a corridor that ended abruptly, a door without a frame. The remaining sister was absent now, replaced by a presence that felt less human, more diffuse. The dreams no longer frightened him in the way they once had. They felt like echoes, reverberations of a structure that had already collapsed. What unsettled him more was the realization that, when awake, he could no longer clearly distinguish which parts of his life had occurred within that house and which had not. The boundaries had eroded completely. He understood then that the house had succeeded in one final way. It had rendered itself inseparable from his perception. Even without walls, it persisted as a mode of understanding the world, a lens through which all experience was filtered. This insight did not arrive with anger or despair. It arrived with a quiet resignation. Elijah had outlived the institution that shaped him, but he had not escaped its imprint. On one particularly cold evening, as he sat wrapped in a thin blanket, staring at a fire that had burned low, Elijah was asked whether he feared death. The question surprised him. He thought about it carefully. Death, he realized, offered something life rarely had: finality, no revisions, no contradictions imposed after the fact, no authority to reinterpret what had been. When he finally answered, he said he did not fear death itself, but he feared being misunderstood after it. He feared becoming a story that others would simplify, distort, or dismiss. He feared that the complexity of what he had endured would be reduced to a curiosity, a rumor, a footnote. Yet even as he articulated that fear, he knew it was inevitable. The world preferred clean narratives, clear villains and victims, beginnings and endings that aligned neatly. His life did not offer that. It offered ambiguity, persistence, damage that could not be easily named. When Elijah died, there was no marker placed where he was buried. No inscription recorded his name, his age, or his history. The ground absorbed him without comment, the way the house had absorbed the vanishing of one sister without acknowledgement. In the years that followed, the land changed hands. Buildings were torn down or repurposed. Records were lost, destroyed, or never kept in the first place. The story of the identical mistresses faded into local rumor, then into nothing at all. No document confirmed it. No ledger recorded the daily tests, the contradictions, the psychological pressure exerted on a single man to force him into a confession that never came. From the perspective of official history, it was as though none of it had happened. And yet, absence does not equal erasure. The effects of what occurred lived on, diffused through generations in ways that could not be easily traced. The habits of caution, the reflexive silence, the expectation of instability, these were passed down not through stories, but through behavior, through the subtle shaping of how people learned to move through the world. Elijah's life became one of countless unseen threads woven into a broader tapestry of survival under conditions designed to fracture identity. The tragedy was not only that his suffering went unrecorded, but that the system which produced it relied on that very lack of record to sustain itself. By ensuring that experiences like his could not be easily articulated or preserved, it protected itself from scrutiny, from accountability. In that sense, the house of identical mistresses did not need to endure physically. Its true architecture was conceptual, built from doubt and enforced ambiguity, capable of reproducing itself wherever power required submission without visible force. To remember Elijah, then, is not simply to recall a singular story, but to acknowledge a pattern, a method by which control was exercised through the manipulation of perception, through the erosion of trust in one's own memory. His refusal to confess, his insist, tense on holding space for uncertainty rather than surrendering to an imposed truth, stands as a quiet form of resistance. It did not free him. It did not dismantle the system. But it prevented that system from claiming his inner certainty completely. In the end, that may be the only victory available under such conditions, the preservation of an internal boundary that cannot be crossed, even when everything else is taken. As you reflect on this story, consider how many lives like Elijah's passed without record, how many realities were shaped by forces that left no visible mark, and how often history mistakes silence for absence. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, question, or see the past differently, then it has done what Elijah himself could not. It has insisted on being remembered. And if you want more stories like this, stories that uncover the hidden structures of power and survival buried in forgotten lives, make sure you subscribe to the Black Timeline. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss future episodes, and leave a comment sharing how deeply this story affected you. Your engagement helps keep these untold histories alive, ensuring that even what was never written down can still be heard.